Good afternoon. I'm Diane Pender-Hughes of the University of Notre Dame. It's my pleasure to introduce Alvin Tillery of Northwestern University to this Empire Room address. The title of his work today, or presentation, is Immigration in the African American Mind, Reverse Racial Triangulation and Proxy Representation, 1865 to 1965. Tillery is associate professor and associate chair in the Department of Political Science at Northwestern. He's also in African American Studies there. His research is in American politics, which focuses on American political development, racial and ethnic politics, and media and politics. His research in political theory focuses on American political thought and critical racial theory. His work is not easy work to do because it involves moving across boundaries that typically political scientists do not engage in. His book, Between Homeland and Motherland, Africa, U.S. Foreign Policy and Black Leadership in America, won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. And his papers have appeared in Studies in American Political Development, Political Research Quarterly, and the Journal of Black Studies. The talk today, which I've given you the title, but I'll read it again, Immigration in the African American Mind, Reverse Racial Triangulation and Proxy Leadership, 1830 to 1945, draws from his manuscript in progress. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alvin Tillery.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a great honor to be here. Particularly, it's very rare in life when we get to have introductions from our dear friends and mentors, as Diane has been to me, so thank you for turning up and doing this. Thanks also to the Empire Lecture Series Committee, Vince Hutchings, who was the chair, Jane Junn, and Rodney Hero in particular, who I know forwarded my name to the committee for consideration. So let's just dive in. It's supposed to be informal and more focused on concepts. So the research questions that animate this talk in my book are essentially how have African American elites responded to immigrants at different stages in U.S. history? Has nativism been a major theme in African American political thought? Have African American elites tended to differentiate between white immigrants and immigrants of color? And what social and economic factors shape the African American elites' responses to immigrants? I'm going to focus primarily on these latter two questions for the purposes of the talk, although the book manuscript covers all of them. And so what motivated me to begin this line of research was the conversation that we've been having for more than a decade about the browning of America. This is a famous Time magazine cover from, I believe, 2002 that talked about the new face of America, right? The sort of hybrid of America that will no longer be sort of easily categorized by the old black-white binary, but will sort of be a sort of multi-shade, sort of multicultural new America. And so I began to sort of read this literature about the large influx of new immigrants. 40 million immigrants have entered the U.S. since 1970, including my wife. Knock on wood. This is on YouTube, so she'll see that, right? The end of the national origins quotas diversified the U.S. population pool beginning in the middle of the 1960s. And African Americans are no longer the largest minority group in the U.S. They've been surpassed by Latinos and Asian Americans. There are projections that they will surpass them going into the next several decades as well. Projections show that the U.S. will be a majority-minority nation by 2050. And so I began to sort of wrestle with how will African Americans deal with these changes, how they historically dealt with the influx of new immigrants. But I wasn't starting from a blank slate. We have many sort of popular narratives in politics about how bad African American politicians in particular are about dealing with new immigrants. And so these are two sort of statements that were made by politicians of color. One is Una Clark, who was running for Major Owens' congressional seat in Brooklyn in the 1990s. And she stated, after NAFTA, our entire immigrant community and leaders didn't like the way that Representative Owens was the only member of the city delegation to vote against parity for the West Indies. As the congressman that represents the largest number of Caribbean immigrants, he should have led the charge on our behalf. So Una Clark, coming from a Jamaican background, was essentially arguing that the African-American Democratic establishment in New York wasn't taking new immigrants seriously. This was her charge. Adelpha Calejo in the 2008 campaign was a prominent Clinton supporter. She said, talking about her experience in Dallas, the irony is that she's standing in front of a multiracial coalition of African Americans and Latinos as the leader of this coalition to desegregate Dallas schools, and she says, blacks haven't done anything to help Latinos. So this is when they're actually doing this movement in the 70s. This is many years later in 2008 as a Clinton surrogate. Blacks haven't done anything to help Latinos. In Dallas, they just used our numbers to further their goals and objectives, right? So there's this kind of narrative out there on the part of immigrant entrepreneurs that black politicians haven't really been very good at reaching out to them and representing their interests. This narrative is pretty well represented in media accounts. A content analysis of media frames of black immigrant relations from 2009 to 2012 shows that 551 items from the New York Times, the Houston Chronicle, and the LA Times, the largest immigrant receiving destinations, these are newspapers in those cities, show that 551 of the items portray relations as conflictual, only 118 portrayed them as being mostly about cooperation. When we look at the frames, the percentage of media frames in the conflict category, we see that black nativism, 16% in the conflict category are about black nativism. 22% are about crime, street-level crime between black and Latino gangs for the most part. And then 3% talk about the racism that the new immigrants bring with them and how that sort of confounds relationships between them and black Americans. So, taking all this in, I notice that there are some really persistent empirical puzzles that the literature and political science has been sort of attuned to. And I'm going to focus primarily only for this talk on this latter one. And that is that African American members of Congress tended to support pro-immigrant initiatives through their rhetoric and voting behavior, right? It's a long-standing finding. And so we've got examples of that. This is, Representative Emanuel Cleaver talking about sort of what he sees to be unfair charges against immigrants being made by the Republican majority. He says, throughout our 40-year history, the Congressional Black Caucus has worked tirelessly to ensure that all Americans, regardless of race, color, or creed, have the chance to pursue and achieve the American dream. I am concerned by the majority's attempt to manufacture tension between the African American and immigrant communities. It seems as though they would like for our communities to think about immigration in terms of us versus them, and I reject that notion, right? And so we've got lots of contrary evidence. One part of this project is I've coded hundreds and hundreds of statements that black politicians across multiple levels have made about immigration, and they are overwhelmingly pro-immigration from what I found. So the core arguments in the overall project and what I'm going to show you today are that African American elites have historically disseminated a pro-immigrant ideology vis-a-vis people of color. They've been pro-immigrant about immigrants of color, right, in the black counterpublic. This ideology is developed organically through a process of what I call reverse racial triangulation that began in the middle of the 19th century. This notion that African Americans and immigrants share a linked fate permeates the black counterpublic between 1850 and 1965. And this contextual element reinforces African American elites' tendencies to try to provide proxy representation to immigrants of color. So I'm building off Claire Jean Kim's really important, indeed seminal work in this area. She did a talk earlier today that was just amazing and is a really good precursor to what I'm doing here. In the 1990s, scholars began to pay more attention to racial attitudes and the role they played in generating conflicts between immigrants of color and African Americans. Kim's book, Bitter Fruit, and her important article, Racial Triangulation of Asian Americans, really starts this conversation. And so what I'm doing is taking her racial triangulation concept, which is primarily a top-down concept. What Kim is looking at in her work is how dominant white elites, right, racially triangulate, how they valorize at certain points certain subaltern racial groups and exclude others. And in this context, this is a cartoon from Harper's, where at the height of the Exclusion Act, you had a Republican politician sort of kicking Asian Americans out of this covenant of equal rights, while simultaneously arguing that you should be bringing freed blacks into the national fold. And so that's the process of triangulation. Triangulation in Kim's work is done by the dominant group to subjugate the two other groups. It's positioning groups on a complex racial field that moves us beyond our understanding of the black-white binary, with whites at the top, blacks at the bottom. It's saying that there are these intermediate groups that are also positioned on that field. Whites continue to exclude that intermediate group, but they typically valorize them to the point where they are above African Americans in this racial field. And she portrayed her model of racial triangulation in this important graph, where she shows that whites are at the top of this pyramidal structure, blacks are at the bottom, and Asian Americans occupy a middle category. This category is defined by sort of whites' attempts to valorize them, so they have a superior position above African Americans, but they are excluded through civic ostracism that makes them perpetual foreigners in the minds of white elites, and that she argues that the white elites write the dominant narrative for politics and the culture, and so this is how people perceive Asian Americans, right? And so what I've tried to do is say that this is right. This story works very, very well for understanding the dominant group narrative about Asian Americans and about race in general. It doesn't work very well, however, when you consider the fact that African Americans have continually contested this narrative through contentious politics, through recognizing that there's elite polarization in the party system. The parties weren't always unified about who belongs where in the dynamic, and so African American social movements would often try to mobilize to exploit division. Moreover, racial formations change, right? And so this is also part of the Kim story. Sort of the valorization, the decision to valorize Asian Americans, to denigrate African Americans, shows that there is movement in racial formation. African American activists are aware of that, and what they're trying to do through this process of reverse racial triangulation is bring Asian Americans into their politics of contesting white supremacy. And so the reverse racial triangulation model says that African Americans recognize that their ostracism is shared with Asian Americans. So they're sending signals up that actually you guys are a lot like us. You should join our struggles. And there are moments in racial history where Asian Americans recognize this. Kim's work shows not as many as we would like, but there are very important moments where there are coalitions formed. And so African Americans, through my research, don't really buy Asian Americans as perpetual foreigner, that part of the model. And so this is what I am pushing, has a sort of model of bottom-up racial triangulation, right? So there are three reasons why I've identified in my research African Americans engage in reverse racial triangulation. One is etymological affinity. They believe that all people of color share some degree of African heritage, right? They're sort of early to the Charles and Mary Leakey viewpoint that all humans are Africans, right? And so this comes across very clearly in 19th century black political thought. And so people of color are often met with a great degree of skepticism when they arrive in America and try to perform whiteness. Sort of black periodicals are filled with sort of statements kind of criticizing and mocking this view and sort of trying to draw these people, convince these people, including immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, to sort of convince them that they are really part of the fold of black Americans. There's also reverse triangulation for coalition politics. Even when they recognize that there's not an ethnological affinity, they say that they are so positioned under the strictures of Jim Crow that it just makes sense for other people of color to join with them to topple white supremacy. And then for altruism, there were times, if we go back to that period when African Americans in the Civil War era, when 225,000 African American troops are fighting for the Union Army, they're actually valorized against the Irish and against the Asian American in popular culture. And in this period, you have black leaders like Frederick Douglass sort of just out of altruistic reasons supporting low-status immigrants in his public rhetoric, right? And so what we see through sort of an analysis of historical data, we see real evidence of linked fate in this content And we see evidence and attempts to engage in proxy representation. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So this is the Douglas example. In 1869, Douglas said, "I have said that the Chinese will come and have given some reasons why we may expect them in very large numbers in no very distant future. Do you ask if I favor such immigration? I answer I would. Would you have them naturalized and have them invested with all rights of citizenship? I would. Would you allow them to vote? I would. Would you allow them to hold office? I would." So 1 year after the 14th Amendment, right, there's no real political interest for Douglas to engage in this kind of reverse racial triangulation except altruism, right? He's not worried about anything. He's at the head of a Republican partisan coalition. The Reconstruction governments are doing very well. We're still 6 years out from the Mississippi counter-Reconstruction. So that's one example, right? Another example from the 20th century is for coalitional politics. This is from the editorial board of the Chicago Defender. It says, "More than 150,000 Puerto Ricans have moved to New York City in the last 2 years and have happily made their homes and in some instances sharing the same buildings with members of the race." So if you know anything about African American history or culture, so it's a race man, race woman, members of the race, that's who they're talking about, right? This situation, which prevails in Puerto Rico and in Europe and South America, is the ultimate hope of all good American citizens for this country. So this, I argue, is a message to Puerto Ricans and to blacks that there's a kind of necessity to form this coalition because this happens in other parts of the world where multiracial democracies exist. Okay, so let's take a look at what I've done with some of the data. I'm doing large-scale content analysis. I've only completed about a third of the sample for what exists in black periodicals. I'm looking at editorials, news items, and letters to the editor. And I've coded sort of about 790 in the period from 1830 to 1900 on Asian Americans. We see the vast majority in raw number have positive commentary, positive frames of Asian Americans. Only 190 have nativist frames. Within this positive category, 222, that's a sweet number. I did not make that up. I don't know how it's there. Right? 222 express a sense of linked fate with Asian Americans. So let's look at it in a pie graph that looks at the percentages. 70% of the content that I've coded so far, and I'm about halfway through the coding, just for these decades, 70% has positive commentary about Asian Americans, right? Now there is nativism. 42% of the commentary is nativist, right? But within that 70%, I broke this out as a pie. These three are related. These are the raw categories. This 24% is nativist, sorry. So 70 is positive, 24% is native, 7% is neutral. They're just talking about Asian American immigrants, not making any kind of claim about their status. 41% of this category is expressing a sense of linked fate with African Americans, right? So let's look at the Latino. Let's skip over the raw numbers in the interest of time and just look at the percentages. The Latino category is interesting. So African Americans are less positive about Latinos, right? Still, within that category, 42% of the positive expresses a sense of linked fate. 31% is nativist. Now, I've got some theories about this that I haven't really been able to prove yet, but I think what's happening is that Latino is not a racial category in 1900 to 1940. Moreover, Latino is a pan-ethnic, multiracial category. You have African American elites having multiple experiences with different immigrants from different places that have different ideas about race. Asian is one of the big ethnological categories starting in the early 19th century that they're very, very certain about that these people are more like us. But you have in places like Florida, New York, Latinos who identify as white coming and as a civil rights strategy stressing their whiteness over their sort of multiracial heritage. And I think that this is what drives down the positive association in this content, right? So we're not supposed to have regression. These are supposed to be big idea talks. We're not supposed to have to. So, but I couldn't help it because this Latino thing is so interesting to me. I wanted to sort of try to get a handle on it. So what I've done is, if we can go back to the raw numbers, I've taken this 455 items that have nativist sentiment in the Latino category, and I've run regressions against some sort of secular trends that Black Americans would be experiencing, right? So GDP growth rate, Black unemployment, race riots, number of lynchings. And what I found is that when unemployment would go up and the number of lynchings would go up, nativist discourse in Black newspapers actually goes down against Latinos. And so this, I think, is further evidence that when Latinos are being framed as part of the race, right, or has a proximate group, the commentary shifts. And so what we're going to try to do is go back through some of that coding. It's going to be really hard, and do a content analysis where we can see if there is some differentiation between Latinos framed as white, framed as other. I didn't think of that when I sent my minions of undergraduate research assistants into the archives to do this coding. But that, I think, would be one way I'm going to try to get traction on this question. So just to wrap up, I argue in this project that both scholarly and popular accounts have exaggerated the extent to which nativism shapes African American responses to new immigrants of color. Reverse racial triangulation is a very real process that makes African Americans important stakeholders in debates over immigration and diversity policies. And the fact that reverse racial triangulation sometimes leads African Americans to see themselves as sharing a linked fate with new immigrants of color portends a bright future for coalition building as we move toward 2050. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes for questions, and we're recording this, so we're going to use the microphone for your questions.
Questions?
This is sort of tangential to what you're talking about, but have you thought about what you think this increased pressure once other immigrant groups, other minority groups are bigger than bigger than African Americans, but also bigger than the white current majority, what that might do for turnout? Do you think that increased pressure on African Americans would increase turnout and engagement, or would do the opposite?
I'm sorry, you trailed off a little bit. Could you say that last part again?
Yeah, do you think, and this is just, have you thought about this question, that this would, that the competition from other minority groups and the fact that minorities are going to be greater than the white majority would put African Americans in a position of higher levels of engagement and turnout and civic participation, or would do the opposite and would alienate further?
Well, I'm not a behavior scholar, but my take on this would be, I don't expect that, because what we know from the behavior literature is that Black Americans are, the most reliable, regular voters when you control for class, anyway, right? And so, I would expect, that trend to sort of certainly be shaped by discourse of racial conflict, right? So think Obama 2008, 2012. I would expect, their already high turnout vis-a-vis other, groups of color, to sort of continue to expand, has the sort of notion of threat, I think, which is what you're getting at, sort of expands. So I certainly do think that the shift will happen, but it won't be because they're worried about Latinos or Asian Americans surpassing them, but it will be because they're worried about white backlash, and I think that's something we should all be worried about as we move toward 2050. I think it's very, very instructive that the Bundy Ranch people who tried to take over Tennecomm and all that they've got a position on Black Lives Matter being a kind of sort of threat to them. I don't think Black Lives Matter even knew about those people until what happened in Oregon. And so I think that as these things continue to happen, we can certainly expect those threats to sort of drive up black participation and hopefully drive up the participation of other groups of color, because it's going to be important. Yeah.
Hi, Alvin. So I was just wondering, you talked about where the data here comes from, and you're interested in sort of, it sounds how these elite presses or letter writers who are most likely going to be more elite as well. So I'm wondering whether this pairs nicely to what we'd expect from a sort of more mass public perspective on this, or are we getting a smaller slice of the black community's attitudes here?
Right. So, I am studying elite politics. It's what are leaders, what messages are leaders sending to new groups and to the dominant group. And again, I'm responding to Claire's brilliant work, so that's what she's focused on as well, right? But I think John Zoller, this kind of elite model, I think that there's a lot to that. I do buy that. I think that we can, and we are, and you guys at Michigan, are doing a lot of this stuff where you're testing, all of these things through experiments, and I think that my story will probably line up. We can go back. There's already studies that show that African Americans and Latinos are beginning to feel a sense of linked fate, for one another. A lot of that work's being done, that you're familiar with, and it goes back to your question as well. So I think it lines up well. I actually, think that where there's a disconnect, it might be on the other side of the triangle. It may be that rank and file immigrants of color don't see the kind of connection in that way, partly because their own elites like Una Clark and Calejo are sending them sort of, discordant messages, but also partly because, they just don't have a sense of the same history. And so that's why I think it's important to do this kind of deep sort of recovery. And I think that, Kim seems to be motivated by a similar imperative, right? So where do these narratives, standard narratives, come from? So that's what I'm responding to. Yeah.
I think the talk was really interesting. I was wondering if you could talk about the sample a little bit more.
Sure.
So like what's the location of the newspapers? Is that affecting, the dialogue or the narrative about these immigrant groups?
So these are all national papers. Again, the sample for the 1830 to 1900, there's a very, there are four dominant abolitionist papers from 1830 to 1875, right? And then you get smaller regional papers. And then in the 20th century, you've got, the Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News. So I've done the cut points by circulation. Which newspapers have the largest circulation, which ones are national. We are now getting digitization of a lot of these regional papers, and that might make a difference. I would love to be able to expend the intellectual and financial resources on doing that, but it's just impossible. But I'm sensitive to the fact that, again, this is a kind of national discourse that I'm trying to capture. But, the starting point with racial triangulation as a theory is also a national discourse. So, yeah. But I do have regional balance. Southern, Northeastern, Western, Midwestern papers.
In both the time periods?
Well, in the abolitionist period, there's only a Northeast, region, right? You've got, people writing in the free states. And so yeah. Hi, Sarah.
Thank you. That's a really terrifically interesting talk. Given that you framed this as a concern about dealing with immigration, I thought if we could go back to your observation about Puerto Ricans moving to New York and ask you to factor in one complicating detail, which is that Puerto Ricans are not immigrants. They're
Right.
American citizens. You know this, of course.
Right.
And I wonder whether, like, the Great Migration might, there may be interesting parallels or something like that, but just to sort of take a moment to reflect on that additional layer of complexity.
Yeah, no, I think that, that's really important, Sarah, because, and it goes back to sort of your earlier question, to the extent that there will be conflict, I'm not certain that first generation immigrants will be the one, the conflict that we see if we go to that crime category, right? What we know about immigrants, they're typically not the ones that are involved in these crimes for a variety of reasons. So we're looking at second generation, third generation Latinos and Asians engaged in kind of, these conflicts. So I think that, the point about Puerto Ricans is well taken, but with the racial formation of, sort of the New Yorican community, they were regarded as a kind of, Hispanic outsider. And there were this notion of citizenship, even though they had the benefit of U.S. colonialism giving them a clearer path, the benefit, right? The way that they were racialized in the early 20th century is really no different than, Mexicans, Cuban Americans. And I think that that's very well substantiated in the Latino studies literature. And so they are really the first group to racialize and, adopt a sort of radical sort of stance on race politics in places like Chicago and New York because of that outsider status as well. Is that answering your question? Or okay.
One more question.
Yeah, so I noticed, I guess, the content analysis that you did of like the news stories, that was mostly pre-civil rights era?
Yes.
Right? Okay. So do you have any indications or thoughts about how maybe some of these perspectives might change once, I guess, African Americans have a more legitimate chance in electoral politics and have maybe more competition, or there's more room for actual competition for resources with some of these other groups?
So we have a lot of info. So the reason that my book goes from 1830 to 1965 is that we have a lot of good data, or we're getting a lot of good data about the interactions between African Americans and new immigrants in places, in cities. My colleague Ruel Rogers, Christina Greer, we're getting a lot of good data, including survey data on this. But we have pretty persistent findings. The most recent one that I'm familiar with is Jack Citron's work from 2001. African Americans have registered greater support for some pro-immigrant policies than whites in public opinion surveys. I think in that same paper, he actually found that African Americans were more supportive of bilingual education than either Asian Americans or Latinos were, right? And so that's why I don't really devote a lot of resources to the civil rights era and the post-civil rights era, because the work that I do is very time-consuming and expensive, and we've got I've got great coding on the way that the media is misframing sort of black attitudes. But there's this is Paula McLean as the president this year, right? So she's done lots of great work on conflict cooperation in cities and small places like Durham. And again, I'm not trying to make the case that blacks don't engage in nativist politics. They certainly do, sometimes, but just way less frequently than they're accused. So, yeah.
All right, well, we have enjoyed this presentation very much. Thank you so much, Professor Tillery. And let's give him a round of applause. And we're going to